rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it. Work for it, ride for it, I'ma organize for it. Stay up in the night and in the morning I'ma rise for it. Heart for it, mind for it, ears for it, eyes for it, peace and a place on this earth for me and mine for it.
Well, we have a real treat this morning on the Money, Power, Land, Solidarity podcast. It's a real honor to sit down and talk with movement artist and strategist and cultural worker, Ricardo Levins Morales. Welcome.
Hey, good morning.
Yes, indeed. So let's jump right into it. You know, I had the real pleasure to be at a celebration of your 50th anniversary as a movement artist, and we looked at decades of your work. And in that, you talked a little bit about your coming to the United States, to Chicago in the 1960s as a teenager. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, when did you arrive in Chicago? What was happening there at that time? And how did that set you on the path that you walked in your lifetime?
Well, the first thing I remember that was happening is that it was hailing when we came in from the airport, you know, and it doesn't do that in Puerto Rico, right? So that was April of 1967, okay? And I grew up on a farm in the mountains in western Puerto Rico. Coffee growing country, my parents grew vegetables though, and then when things cooled off politically enough, there was a period of repression after the Nationalist Rebellion in 1950, and my father was eventually able to get a teaching job in San Juan, which was a 4-hour drive from where we lived in the mountains, but he'd go down for a few days and come back. When the political winds changed again, and he was purged. Also, my sister, who was a couple of years older, was reaching adolescence and facing a lot of male predatory pressure. And so all these things came together, and my folks decided to go to Chicago. And oh my God, what wasn't happening in Chicago? For me, it was a combination of immigration, adolescence, and revolution, right? It was like a perfect storm of chaos and instability.
Wow.
And really, Aurora and I were pretty much out on our own quite a bit. My mother was dealing with alcoholism. My father was dealing with taking care of her. And we were out on the streets. All of us were drawn into the politics in one way or another. My folks had been, you know, active in the anti-colonial movement and in radical movements before that. But that's kind of what we landed in, right?
Yeah.
1967, and you know, it took a little while to sort of get our bearings, but by the next year, 68, you know, there was a lot of wildfires.
Yeah, 1968 Chicago, that was like the Democratic convention, right? And big protests and movements to confront that, and it's like the context of the Black Panther Party and the Young Lords and generally a social movement moment. You talked a bit about the assassination of Fred Hampton,
right,
and how that impacted you. Could you speak on that a little bit?
So Fred Hampton was the chair of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, a young, charismatic guy. And you know, the Panthers, by the time I came to Chicago, it was the momentum was really shifting in the Black liberation struggle from the civil rights movement in the old plantation South into the northern cities, where it was, you know, under the banner mostly of Black Power movement, and that's where the Panthers emerged from, right? And they burst on the scene really quickly. They did a dramatic action at the California State Legislature that blasted them into the news all over the country, and then everybody in the Black communities wanted to join the Panthers. So I was aware of them, and I would go up to the Young Lords area and help with some of their projects. They were a Puerto Rican street gang who became politicized, became radicalized, reached out to the Panthers for advice on how to do it, right? So, you know, Chairman Fred was organizing a really groundbreaking alliance involving the Young Lords, the Black Panthers, and a white street gang called the Young Patriots, which were woven together into what they called the Rainbow Coalition. And in fact, they were dealing with issues of police brutality and gentrification. I mean, a lot of what these communities were struggling with was holding on to communities while they were being pushed out.
Wow.
One of the projects I helped with, just as a young kid volunteer, but was People's Park in the Young Lords, near the Young Lords Church. They had taken over a church. And it was an empty lot that the city wanted to turn into a tennis club in the middle of the poor Puerto Rican barrio, right? That would, charge $100 admission and obviously be out of reach and out of the interest range of people in the community.
Yeah.
So the Lords took it over with other community people, planted trees, put up playground equipment, so this is People's Park.
Wow.
So yeah, what we're talking about with land solidarity, power, gentrification, this is very basic to what these organizations were struggling around. And it was because of that groundbreaking work that basically Chairman Fred was killed by a police death squad in December of '69. And it was a police department operation planned out of the state attorney's office with logistical and advice support from the FBI. The head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, who was a rabid segregationist lawyer from Virginia, was really paranoid about the emergence of what he called a black messiah. He was afraid of a black leader who could reach across racial lines and create the kind of alliance that Chairman Fred was actually bringing into being.
Yeah, rest in power, Chairman Fred. I want to come back to these questions of gentrification, but first, just if we could briefly then, how did you move from Chicago to Minneapolis? And if you could just give folks, we could probably talk all day about your work, but what has your work been since you've been in Minneapolis?
So after, I moved out of home early. I moved out of my parents' home at 15, dropped out of high school the next year, and I was basically sharing an apartment with other kids my age, other teen males who had moved out of their families or whatever for a variety of reasons. I kicked around Chicago for a few years, just sort of doing whatever I could figure out as a kind of a hunter-gatherer, figure out how to get by, get enough resources to get by another day, another week. After a few years of that, my sweetheart at the time and I decided to get out of town. And we ended up, through some roll of the dice, in a little factory town in New Hampshire. And there were factories still in this country at that time.
Wow.
Right?
Imagine that.
If nothing else dates me, that sure does.
Yeah.
So they were little textile mills, furniture mills. A lot of them were going under. The shoe mills in that area were closing down as they either moved overseas or moved to the south. The textile factory I worked at, one of them had just moved its headquarters from New England to North Carolina. And the head of that company was the president of the National Right to Work Association, which was a rabidly anti-union.
Wow.
I didn't know that at the time,
And they were using that language, right to work, back then.
That's correct. National Right to Work.
For folks listening, right to work is, right-wing legislation aimed at chipping away at union power and working class solidarity and generally depressing wages and legally making it difficult for people to form unions. And I've heard of right to work. I didn't realize that language went that far back.
Yeah, so that was the Milliken Company. And I was actually in the oldest continually operating textile mill in New England.
Wow.
So that goes back to the Industrial Revolution. And one of my parts of my job was operating the oldest continually operating freight elevator, which was not a badge of pride, but I somehow made it through.
Wow. So then from New Hampshire to
New Hampshire,
Minnesota.
Yeah, I ended up drifting down to Boston, which is kind of like the gravitational center of that region, right? Everyone sort of drifts toward the biggest city.
My DJ actually is New Hampshire, and I know when he's going to the city, he's heading to Boston.
There you go.
Yeah.
And where else would you go? So in Boston, I was working, again, a variety of jobs in restaurants and street vending. I worked as a janitor in a hospital there, just as a union organizing drive was starting to get off the ground. So I got very much involved in that, really caught the bug for organizing, for union organizing anyway, and eventually had to face the question of where I wanted to be. I'd been moving around for a bit, and I was kind of tired of moving around all the time. I was like, well, where am I going to be? If I don't make a conscious decision, I'm going to end up where I am. And it's like, having been in Chicago, Boston felt like a small town.
Wow.
After a couple of years, it felt like a big city.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I don't think I want to be in a place that's quite that huge and urban. Remember, I grew up on a mountaintop.
Yeah.
But I also was teaching myself screen printing out of a little booklet and getting some materials, and
Wow.
Wanted to be in a place that I felt could support a screen printing habit. Maybe a town that had some colleges or something would have some of the cultural stuff I liked, but being a dropout, I didn't want to be in a place that was totally dominated by, like Berkeley or Ann Arbor, Madison, right? It's like, no, that's not my world, and the community turns over all the time.
Yeah.
So this was one of the places on my short list. I traveled through here one summer and was looking at cities. And I ended up getting together with some friends, all of whom wanted to leave wherever the heck they were living. And we compared lists, and this was the one place on all of our short lists that overlapped. We said, okay, everyone go home, pack up your stuff, and we'll meet in the fall.
Awesome. Lucky us in the Twin Cities.
And I've been here ever since. And then also when my first child was born, I was like, okay, going to be here for a while.
Yeah.
I've experienced what it is being moved as a young person. And it's like, okay, I got through, but it's not really what I'd wish on someone. If I, with a couple of young kids, it's like, if I can't promise them that wherever we go is going to provide them what they need as much as this place, why even do it, right?
Yeah. I have the pleasure of knowing your children, so again, lucky us. And could you just briefly then, what's your work been since you've been here? I know you as a movement artist and just kind of strategic thinker and supporter in a lot of ways. Could you just give kind of a brief synopsis of how you spent your time in Minneapolis?
Well, the first thing I had to do is, of course, find work, and that was, again, janitorial jobs and home weatherizing. Eventually, I ended up working in screen printing shops because I already had given myself some of the basic knowledge of that. And looking around for how to get involved with activism. It's like 1976, and the anti-war movement had just basically collapsed. The Black Power and the movements I'd been associated with were in retreat. They'd been militarily crushed. Huge money was pouring into the nonprofit system to kind of suck away the initiative and leadership that had been in these more militant struggles. And so I landed here at that time, looked around, and it was also winter was closing in. And it's like, where is anyone?
Yeah.
There's nothing moving on the streets, right? And how do you find out what's going on? There was no internet, What we had instead of the internet were newspapers, leaflets, newsletters, and bulletin boards.
Never heard of those.
I know, right? Bulletin boards were like the lifeblood,
Wow.
And it's not you'll check out what's going on. No, that was where people went to. It's like Democracy Wall. That's where you go and find out what's going on, who to connect to. There's a phone number. You copy down that phone number, you call somebody, right?
Wow.
And the way I really made contact with folks is that I really had the bug to get back and visit in Puerto Rico, get back to the community there, at least to visit. So I had my silk screen set up, and I just contacted any organization whose name I could find, said, give me $200, I'll make 200 posters screen printed about your issue. And that way I raised enough money to get down there, and I found out a little bit about what was going on in town.
Wow.
So really, getting involved with some of those groups lasted me for about 3 years. There was guerrilla theater happening. I was peripherally involved in that, around a tenant strike. And eventually we formed the Northline Poster Collective in 1979 out of a conference of cultural workers. That term was just starting to come into use at the time, cultural workers, to really demonstrate that artists were workers and that what we did was labor, and it was also associating us with movements for social justice. And the graphic arts workshop, we had a good discussion, said, let's keep meeting, let's form a group, and that's what we eventually did.
Cool.
And it centered around screen printing primarily in the early days. Activists would come in from other groups and we'd teach them how to screen print themselves. Some of the picket signs, protest signs we made for some of those groups are actually still in use.
Awesome.
But people doing a campaign for political prisoner or anti-war, whatever it was, I have a poster kicking around here with a cutout cartoon of the Shah of Iran, right, when he was coming to the States and people were protesting.
Wow. Wow. In your time here, I want to shift a bit, and the general theme of our podcast, the window we're using to step into these big questions of race and class and power, is this Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment in North Minneapolis, and from there, kind of gentrification at large. How have you seen gentrification show up in Minneapolis in your time here? You've been here for some decades. Have you seen it change your neighborhood, change your patterns of life or the surroundings around you?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no, and I've been seeing that everywhere I go. It's like gentrification is kind of like slash and burn agriculture. It's always happening, right? So for about 5,000 years, agriculture on our planet was slash and burn, meaning you clear a little patch of forest, you grow food for maybe a couple of years until the soil gets depleted, then you let it rest for any number of years, depending on where you are and how rich the nutrients are, and then you plant again, right? So that's kind of what gentrification's like. It's not just, people think about it as this linear process. You got a neighborhood, a working class neighborhood, artists start moving in, then they get displaced, and, et cetera. But it really is more cyclical. So that the period of depletion, the period during which you have housing stock aging and not being maintained, and slumlords jacking up the rent all the time on people who don't have many options. That's part of the cycle, right? It's and then you get the colonization of artists or yuppies and coffee houses, and when that sort of brings in enough investment to bring improvements to the neighborhood, then the larger investors get interested and they want to be putting up condo high rises and all the rest. Now, once you get homeowners in there, they have the NIMBY defense. They're not in my backyard defense. So they're able to kind of hold the line a little bit for a little while on the types of development that will push them out, or anything that might bring dark and poor folks back, right? Yeah. But even that eventually collapses in the face of even bigger moneyed interests. And eventually those buildings start aging, and rather than investing in it, the cycle begins again. And you start, it becomes a little more affordable. Black folks start moving in, or other people of color. Real estate people start coming in and saying to the white homeowners, hey, you might want to be getting out of this neighborhood. We'll buy your house for cheap. And the cycle just keeps going.
Yeah. I really appreciate that. I remember you said to me, almost in passing one time, I think, and helped me understand. I grew up in Northeast Minneapolis and saw the cycle bear out, where you start to see the artists coming in and new things changing, and something makes you uncomfortable but can't really name it. And then all of a sudden it's much bigger money, big buildings. I remember the signs all around, 50 more police. And you talking about the cycles of capital flow helped me understand that the white flight and the divestment that happened in the decades before gentrification are a part of the process, that folks with the money intentionally let the value of the land in the neighborhood drop so that when they come back, it's fertile ground for them to profit because they could buy cheap and sell high. I wanted to ask you about, some of the roots of our capitalist system, and really gentrification being capitalism at work in the urban environment, going back to the enclosures of the commons in feudal Europe. Can you talk about that moment in history and that legacy? Like, what was the real seed of what we're living through today in terms of like the domination of our lives by private capital and the way of thinking that comes with private property?
Well, small question. I'll do my best.
Well, something
anyway,
on a Tuesday morning for you.
I know, right? Well, I mean, capitalism, the seeds of capitalism really kind of start sending out rootlets around the same time as the seeds of anti-black racism and white supremacy and colonialism. They all come together. Capitalism wouldn't be without colonialism, because until that time, contrary to all these mythologies about the European miracle, right? Really, Europe was not any more advanced than areas in China, Southeast Asia, Africa, Mesoamerica even, although the economics were different. So that the only thing that really stood out was when Europe, that had all this excess shipping from all its internal wars, used those ships to go start expanding to Africa and the Americas. That brought in huge amounts of capital that spread out even, and that financed trade with China. It financed everything about Europe. And the commons themselves really were the ways in which, and this sort of is a long downstream heritage from the slash and burn era, right? 5,000 years before. But the idea that small landholders or peasants or farmers or campesinos of various sorts could use the forest and the common lands to graze their animals, to gather firewood, which was a big deal, to gather edibles. And starting the 1400s, you call it a moment in history, but it's a long moment, right?
Yeah.
It lasts a few hundred years. But all over Europe, something like 4,000 different laws were passed at different times, incrementally closing off people's access to these common lands, right? And it's really a couple of things happening at the same time that's really important to understand. One is that the rich people, the big landowners, wanted more for themselves. Of course, they wanted land, because that was kind of how wealth happened. But it also was the time of the rise of the textile mills, which were the first and second, I can get to that, industrialization under capitalism. And what that meant was that they needed workers. And so what you do if you need workers to do what you want is you cut off their sources of resilience. So that if these people who are working the land and using the commons no longer have access to the commons, they can't feed themselves. So they've got to come to you, right? If you're a factory owner, it's the same way when if they're domesticating a horse, domesticating some wild animal, right? Control their food source and use that as a sort of reward and punishment thing until you get them under control. So that part of the closing of the commons was to get an obedient workforce.
Yeah.
And you see that today too, is that there's all kinds of continual examples of closing off the commons, including now the equivalent of the commons is social services and the common good, that attacking all of these social wage type of services for people makes them more and more and more and more dependent on the owners of companies.
Yeah.
So it's not just that the upper class wants those funds that are being wasted in their mind on poor people. They want poor people to have fewer options.
Wow. I think, you hear the word neoliberalism thrown around so often. And my understanding of the basics of the neoliberal order is very much that, closing off the public sector, cutting people off from any commonly held, publicly held wealth so that they're dependent on the rich and forced with no options to have to play by the rich's game. And then just making that connection in my mind based off what you're saying, that the original liberalism was this era when private property ascended and people were thrown off the public land and then forced to work for a wage. So it's really that continuity, it's the same ideology at play.
Well, when I said that textile was the first and second form of industrialization, because one thing that is really tends to be overlooked, ignored, or buried, frankly, is that the plantation slave system was in many ways the cutting edge of the Industrial Revolution. So that sugar plantations, for example, were highly developed factories that were developing all of these methods of industrial workforce, and required all this capital going in, and the slave system really generated the capital that then was reinvested. Because, what is it that, it started out being woolen mills, but then they quickly turned to cotton mills, right? And where is that labor coming from? Where is that wealth coming from? But one thing that you sort of touched on here about kind of the nature of how gentrification fits in, I have kind of a little synopsis that can apply to capitalism, but it most precisely applies to gentrification, and it's kind of all you really need to know. And that's that it's kind of the opportunist's guide to real estate. That if you want to make money off of rich people, you expand their options. If you want to make money off of poor people, you reduce their options.
Wow.
Right?
Can you say more about that?
Let's just have a moment of silence and let everybody absorb that.
Yeah.
No, it's like, okay, but I'll actually repeat it. You want to make money off of rich people, you expand their options. You want to make money off of poor people, you limit their options, right? So that people who have little money they're dependent, you're going to be jacking up the rent. They have no place to go.
Yeah.
And other landlords are jacking up the rent too. And then there are all of these ways in which your options are limited, right? Certainly the way they hand out felony and misdemeanor convictions, or not even convictions, plea bargains like penny candy in poor communities means that once again, your job options, your housing options, your education options, everything is limited, and that's the way you get squeezed. You have no choice.
Yeah.
Every offer you're made is an offer you can't refuse. And what your housing is being replaced with are all of these wonderful condos that try to attract buyers with all the amenities that they offer. They make it all the great variety and the best they can offer so that rich people will be attracted to it. Poor people, hey, you just cut off their other options and you got them, right? And that's kind of how the system works. And that it's really about vulnerability. And vulnerability is, again, one of the ways that not only capitalism works as an economy, but as a social system, right? So that, and this is starting even way before capitalism in the earliest oppressive hierarchical societies, but you got some people who do the crappiest work and have the crappiest conditions, some people who are a bit better off, and they have a stake in supporting the system because at least they're not doing the crappy work.
Yeah.
You're not doing the transportation or the mining or the things that happened in the earliest city states. You have, once you create a system where some people are vulnerable, that attracts predators and parasites of all kinds. So that there's a lot of functioning of racism, for example, that doesn't require the people who are profiting from it to be personally prejudiced or anything. They're just opportunists, right? I mean, if you're in the sex trafficking trade in Duluth and you're kidnapping young people to be in that, who are you going to kidnap? The child of some, state legislator or a rich business person or a young, dark person from, an under-resourced community, right? Where are the police resources going to go?
Yeah.
Where's the response? What can you get away with? So that vulnerability becomes like a whirlpool, drawing in all of these different economic factors that reinforce and reinforce and reinforce it, because that's where the money comes in.
We're in a moment right now in Minneapolis where the city is the orthodoxy is to sell private land or public land to private developers and increase the tax base, and it's very much a real estate focused economy. And at the same time, we're seeing calls to increase funding and increase the amount of officers on the Minneapolis police force that has a really deadly and brutal track record in vulnerable communities. Can you talk about that relationship? I think you kind of did, but even just again to talk about what is the real function of the police in this economy, and why would Minneapolis, after such a poor showing by the Minneapolis police, be calling for such a massive investment right now in the police force?
Yeah. Well, so there's really two questions there. I think one is kind of what is the fundamental function of police, and the second is how is that expressing itself now, and how does that relate to housing and gentrification. And the answer to the first question is that, the police system has a number of roots that go back, to London, to New York, to North Carolina. Some of them were literally slave patrols, or the militias that were created to put down rebellions and then were institutionalized into police forces. But for the most part, it really came into its own as a system following the Civil War. And it was put in place to answer one of the urgent dilemmas of the time as far as the white power structure was concerned, and that is how to keep black folks in servitude after emancipation. And the solution they came up with was criminalization.
Yeah.
So at that time, it had to do with special black laws or black codes that were just aimed at black people, right? And funneling them into the prison system so they could do inmate leasing them back out to factories and plantations essentially is a continuation of slavery. And that's evolved, we can talk about all the different stages, but it certainly turned into the war on drugs, the war on crime, all of these different forms of racializing the Jim Crow laws, right? So it's part of it's just unequal enforcement, right? Two people, dark light, do the same thing. One of them gets a slap on the wrist, and the other is doing 10 years in Stillwater. Right?
Yeah.
So really, it's about criminalizing, and what that does is that when you slap somebody with a conviction, it's like branding them permanently on their record. They're cut off from access to, they're taken out of competition, essentially, with white folks.
Yeah.
For jobs, education, credit, housing, voting, serving on juries, and so forth, right? So it's a real disenfranchisement that feeds the cycle. And then their kids grow up under those conditions, and they're also constantly being targeted, targeted by the police. And the central function of the police is not fighting crime, it's really criminalizing dark folks. So that when you look at 150 years of policing, you see a lot of different functions that have been added to the police at different times, some taken away. But this central racialized function is the only one that they do well and consistently. The other ones, all the social servicey sorts of things, they rarely do them well. If they do, it's because some exceptional person who joined the force because they had a passion about sexual assault or whatever, and they wanted to support young women, right? But in terms of a system, there always any other agency in the city would do a better job.
Yeah.
In part because people fear and or hate the police so much that they simply don't trust them.
Yeah.
When it comes to the place of the police in a city, that has shifted over time depending on where the power in a city lies. When I came to Chicago in 1967, Mayor Richard J. Daley was his honor, the mayor, one of the last of the big city bosses, and the Chicago police really functioned as the patronage enforcement arm. And, they would go around, and one of my housemates in that apartment, his uncle was a bagman for a local police captain, right, who would go around and collect the bribes from brothels and other businesses like that. That's kind of how the system worked, right?
Yeah.
And as those big city machines slowly disintegrated with modernization and, under sort of the rise of the technocrats, the police ended up just being the most powerful force within city governments. And who do they serve, right? If they're not serving the big city bosses, they serve whoever is dominant in the local urban aristocracy. And this has turned out to be developers and real estate interests for the most part. And that's really who they're serving. So that when a neighborhood is targeted for gentrification, one of the first signs is police moving in and harassing poor people and dark people. And as gentrification begins, the people moving in to colonize that neighborhood, new white homeowners will be calling the cops because of some suspicious person who actually has lived there their entire life, and they're just pushing their baby in a stroller.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden, they become the outsiders that the police are coming to harass and question and push around.
Yeah, I thought, I shared at the hearing last month, folks mobilized a great show of force to try to stop the mayor's plan for millions and millions of more dollars for the police. And a good example is, like you said, the local urban aristocracy. We have a white billionaire family that's a dominant interest all across all sections of the economy in Minnesota. I'm still wrapping my mind around how powerful this oligarchic family is. They got city-owned land sold to them downtown. Literally was a parking lot where a group of youth workers would store their materials for their street outreach work downtown. So these are folks who are, doing great work out there, building with the young people who are on the streets downtown, hooking people up with resources, connecting people to art opportunities. And they get displaced in favor of this billionaire family who builds a luxury tower. And then the call from the public subsidy that comes with that is more police officers so that these new white wealthy residents are going to feel safe downtown. So I just think you couldn't get a more clear example of the dynamics you're talking about, where you limit the options of poor people. You either get in line, pay the rent, or go to jail, and we're going to make money off you that way, and then just completely cater to the interests of the white and wealthy.
Yeah, well, what you're talking about there, the way that city planners and developers would look at that piece of land is as being underutilized.
Mm-hmm.
In real estate lingo, there's something called the highest best use, which means what will generate the most, most wealth for people who already are capitalizing on a lot of wealth.
Yeah, I hear that phrase used often in some of the spaces I'm in, and every time it just triggers me. My heart starts beating, my face gets hot, and it just passes as an apolitical statement, but it's so violent when you really get down to what it is. I've, over the time, found some of your writing really useful in taking a step back and reflecting on what's happening around us in the social movement space. And I was reviewing some things before we sat down to talk, and you talk about the Titanic Compact, an agreement made between the ruling classes, various factions of the ruling class. Can you talk about what the Titanic Compact is and how you see that showing up specifically in our local context in Minneapolis?
Yeah, well, it's really a metaphor for the nonprofit system and government agency system, right? So the Titanic, as most people know, was a huge ship that was rammed into a iceberg at the cost of many lives because of the greed of its owners, right?
Yeah.
But the point is that after the movements of the 60s and 70s were sent into retreat by a combination of bribery and repression, the nonprofit system that rose in place of those movements was operating, I describe it as kind of the Titanic system, where you get to organize for what people need, for people's immediate needs on the deck of the Titanic, but you get to ask where the ship is going, how fast it's going, or who owns it. Right, so there's this careful division of labor where if you're working for a nonprofit in a community, you're dealing with the symptoms of a system that is crushing people, but you are not dealing or even talking about or even mentioning the fact that that system exists.
Yeah.
That in fact, many of the things that cause us harm are not systems that are broken, they're systems that are, in our view, crooked, right? They're systems that are structured to be oppressive and to extract wealth. I mean, capitalism is about a 500 or 600 year old system, if you want to go back to its embryonic stage, that essentially functions to concentrate wealth more and extract wealth from people and land and put it into fewer and fewer and fewer hands.
Yes.
Right, and that's part of the crisis of the world that we're in right now, is that it's gotten to the point where it's really hard to hold that together. Yeah. And it's hard to hold it together in this country too, so that when you reach the declining stage of an empire, the way we're in with the US empire, and you reach a stage where it's harder for the 1% to really generate profits the way they have before, it also becomes hard to get people to believe in you and to believe in the system, so which is why you can explain only through that lens why a rinky-dink police department like Ferguson, Missouri would end up with world-class military hardware, right? It's that policing steps in to fill those voids, and you start seeing more of a merging of private and repressive functions, so that the police system really, there's kind of a fiction that it's under the authority of the city government. But Mayor Fry and the city council, the best they can do is they can budget and they can appoint a chief who serves at the whim of the rank and file.
Yes.
Police chiefs in our system are not very powerful. They just come and go, and neither are mayors. But the police department is integrated in with what they call regional fusion centers, where you have different police departments, sheriff departments, and private security companies, all sharing information and data, and of course the private companies don't have to obey public disclosure laws, and then those are connected to Homeland Security. You have this entire system. They're integrated as much as they can get away with ICE and the immigration system, and with the business class. So that here the downtown council actually has an office housed within the downtown police precinct.
Are you serious?
Right, the division, DID, I forget what it stands for.
Yeah.
And some of its functions are fine,
Downtown
escorting
Improvement
drunk
District.
people back to their cars, I'm told, but also they have access to surveillance cameras, and as they like to boast, work closely with the police to keep downtown safe for capitalism, essentially, right?
Yeah.
Keeping out the people who don't want to be there.
Absolutely.
Because as people are designated as surplus, they're no longer treated as people, right? And all they basically need to be moved around in ways that will allow the market to keep functioning the way it's supposed to function.
Yeah, downtown is supposed to be a nice playground for people with disposable income to come spend their money and pay big rents, and the presence of poor people and brown and black people makes that uncomfortable. So yeah, they get shipped out. I think the dynamics that you're starting to speak on there between where power is really generated and where power is really exercised, and then where kind of just the symbols of power are kind of dealt with. We talked about that from the perspective of the ruling class. Another metaphor that I've heard you use in the past that I really like, in a way to talk about that dynamic from a social movement revolutionary perspective, is this idea between moon spaces and sun spaces. And, in our organizing against the Upper Harbor Terminal, a lot of things point towards when's the next time it's going to come to a city council vote, and trying to get us to understand that that's one moment, but for us to really generate the type of movement and power to shift things, we can't be relegated to that space. Could you talk a bit about what you mean by moon spaces and sun spaces?
Sure. Well, the metaphor runs on sunlight. That I consider the spaces where decisions supposedly are made. That includes city councils, it includes union management negotiating tables, peace treaty spaces, legislatures, and even the Supreme Court as moon spaces, meaning that you can work by the light of the moon, but the moon actually doesn't generate any light. It reflects light, right? Power comes from the sun. So that these spaces are not the seats of power, they are where power is reflected and the balance of power is reflected. So that if you have a city council, even like what we just had recently is a wave of progressive community activists being elected to our city council. They're going into a moon space. And if they don't have a lot of sunlight coming in from organized people's movements, then they're not going to be able to, their dreams aren't going to come true of the changes they thought that they would be able to make when they kind of imagined that those were actual places where power happened. Because the other side is beaming in, these high voltage, spotlights, right?
Yeah.
From the developers and the corporations and so forth. And that's the light that is shown in there, and that's where the power that people can see, the voices that people can hear, right? So that in order to affect what goes on in those spaces, you actually have to have that power on the outside. Now, it doesn't mean that the skill sets and consciousness of the people on the inside don't matter, but what they have to work with is what matters most. And what we have are instances like Upper Harbor where you have people mobilizing around a particular struggle, and it's like a movement arises to deal with this development atrocity, but you don't have a movement of movements, right? You don't have a movement that delegitimizes the idea that developers should be running the show in the first place.
Yeah.
And as long as that drumbeat is what is in the ears of the media and the politicians and the city agencies and all the rest, we're up against all of that combined sort of what they would call common sense. It becomes common sense. Of course, this is the way things run. How can we do things without the developers? Then we're fighting an uphill battle.
Yeah.
And we're subject to their threats, right? Just recently, now the city council is talking about some new set-aside program where developers will have to set aside a certain number of units for affordable housing, and some small, tiny percentage. In some cases, I don't know how it is here, but in most cities, there's a sunset on that, so that you have to provide affordable units for a certain number of years, and then it fades out.
Same here.
And the downtown council and the realtors are screaming that, oh my gosh, you're meddling in the market. If you put these restrictions in place, we're not going to be able to afford to develop here. We're going to go to other cities. And it's like this mantra. You're going to be hurting the very people you want to help. Oh, my God.
You better be careful there.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that, right? Thinking about talking to you, and I looked up what happened in New York in 1911 after the Shirtwaist Triangle factory fire, right? You have this huge fire, 146 workers die in this fire. And there's sort of a lot of shenanigans behind that about codes and all that. And following that, it's a huge national scandal, right, that this happened. And they start talking about putting in various kinds of regulations for sprinklers, for doors being unlocked, for dust in the factories. And the factory owners were saying, no, this is terrible. If you do that, all of the factories are going to flee to Pennsylvania, to New Jersey, to other places that are more friendly to us. And you're going to end up hurting the very people you want to help, right?
Yeah.
Several years after, they put in like 20 or 25 actual regulations that to enforce safety in the factories. Some years later, the New York Times did a study and said not a single factory or business moved or is threatening to move because of the new regulations. It's all bluster, right?
Yeah.
They're just being gifted huge amounts of money to basically sink their talents into communities and suck more wealth out.
Yeah, absolutely. You already hear them with the same type of bluster around rent control, even the specter of rent control coming in. You hear nothing will get built, it'll mean less apartments. Somehow rent control means the rent is going to go up. And I really think that you're right in terms of the deep cultural work we have to do to get people to have the wherewithal to be able to withstand that bluster and not get bluffed off of our square, but say, no, there's many ways we could organize our lives that make sense for us where our interests are put front and center, but there's so much of that rhetorical space coming from the developers that it's almost hard to break through.
Oh, it's actually kind of amusing in a way if you break it down, because what they say essentially is that if you want to help rich people, help rich people. If you want to help poor people, help rich people.
Yeah.
And if you try to help poor people, it'll backfire and hurt the very people you want. Now, all of a sudden, they're concerned about those people, right?
It's funny because there's a particular fellow, I won't say his name, he's a prominent landlord, was the chair of the landlord lobby that ran this completely Orwellian campaign, safe and affordable neighbors, grass tops campaign to try to stop some very basic tenant protections, who are always using these, you're going to hurt the very same people you're intending to help. And I noticed that every time he speaks in a public meeting, he speaks from the perspective of his renters. My renters told me, but I realized, your renters are never here in the room. And somehow they always have a really convincing argument for your profit line, and it's offensive, but all you can kind of do is laugh, because when you see it for what it is, they're so bold and so brash with what they think they can get away with.
Well, actually, there's a kind of beauty in it, too, in that they're making a very convincing case, which I happen to agree with, that capitalism is incompatible with meeting people's needs. And every time you say, we need to address people's needs, we need to save the environment, we need children to grow up in safe spaces, they say, no, oh my God, no, that doesn't work. The market can never support that. Well, thank you for making that very clear to us.
Absolutely. And that's the reality. What I'm realizing is I think people who spend their time in establishment nonprofits or in sanctioned spaces really don't take anti-capitalism or socialist or left politics seriously. So anything that violates the rules of the market becomes, we can't do it, when what we really need is an organized force that says, we absolutely need to do it. And exactly what you're saying is, you're right, capitalism cannot provide for us, so let's stop tinkering around the edges. And really, I think one of the goals of this podcast is to articulate a serious socialist political economy where you're right, the landlords can't meet our needs, but we seriously can. It's not just a hip moral critique, it's actually we need a different economy.
Yeah, and also, I mean, part of it is that we're always given false choices. And when you're given false choices, all humans, all organisms will take the best choice that's on the menu, right?
Yeah.
So the question is expanding the menu, right? So that in northern Minnesota, they tell you you can either have safe drinking water or you can have jobs, right? And as long as that is all that's in front of us, then we simply accept those kinds of options.
Yeah.
And they laugh all the way to the bank.
You can either have a high rise that's all luxury condos, or you can have this policy you're talking about, inclusionary zoning, where you get 10% units affordable at 80% area median
And
income.
affordable is in quotes.
Yeah, exactly. It's a false choice where like nobody presents the option of you could have safe and beautiful and dignified public housing that's affordable for everybody in perpetuity with no time limit. We're getting to I have a one question or two more questions that I want to make sure we get to. One is, in your study of movement history and your long history of participating in social movements, can you point towards some struggles against real estate capital or these development projects or even, enclosures of the commons? Like you said, this happens in such more brutal and vicious ways in the periphery and in the global South and brown and black countries. When we're thinking about gentrification and battling gentrification, if folks listening want to learn more to find some examples of folks that could give us some hope and some strategy, where could we look for folks who have stood up against these big private real estate interests and had some success?
Well, I think you look in, you dig into the story, whatever stories are there, the accounts of people in struggle is always there. I don't really know there are resources and books out there that I just am not qualified to talk about, but there have been struggles in Boston, in different cities, that it's always an ebb and flow. It's always success and failure. We're still learning how to do this. But for example, I encounter these struggles, I go to a labor conference and there are people there from Bangladesh who are involved in struggles to not only protect their lands, but retake lands from the big landowners and the factory workers. You have the landless movement in Brazil. You have the, Via Campesina in Latin America. You have, that's a lot of what the struggles happening around post-Katrina or post-Hurricane Maria, in these different areas. So, no, I wish I'd come with a bibliography for you or anything, but but it's always happening there, and even you have to understand that the status quo in a lot of places is really the result of a mix of the power of the landowner class and the power of the communities. So the fact that the New York realtors are working really hard to destroy rent control, the system of rent control, is a tribute to the fact that rent control has been an entrenched system for a long time. Right, and it's the same as other kinds of spaces too. The fact that in England the neoliberals and the fascists are in full bloom attack on the health system is a tribute to the fact that working people have created and defended that health system for all those years.
Absolutely.
So just kind of everything we have to work with now is a partway point along the balance of power between classes, really,
Yes.
A word that we don't use very much in our language,
Absolutely.
but that explains a tremendous amount, including about racism and other forms of oppression.
Absolutely. I'm curious, how have you cared for your heart and for your spirit and for your body over these decades of struggle? This is not easy work, and it's not an easy world to live in. And just, for folks who are embarking on this long haul journey and want to stay at it, do you have any thoughts for folks as far as how to keep a light heart and a smile on your face? And, I hear you talk about resilience a lot, and I really appreciate that. Do you have any thoughts for folks?
Well, like everything else, I'm a partial example, struggling with like everyone else. But, one thing is a commitment, actually, I think. A commitment to smiling. Just try it, right? And just in terms of the message it sends to myself, not as a form of performing for other people. Right? But I'm also happen to be a visual artist, I was just seeing an article about how 45 minutes of doing art lowers your cortisol levels, right? Stress hormones and things in the body.
Yeah.
Things that take us out of ourselves and allow us to interact with beauty and understanding of the world. For me, a big piece of it comes from actual understanding. That understanding a story that supports resilience, and that story has to be credible and accurate. It's not about self-fooling and self-pretense. I grew up in a mountain area where I didn't have digital distractions, which meant that I learned about things having cycles and rates of depletion and rates of regeneration, and that resilience actually is essentially synonymous with life. That every cell, every organism is always operating on a hopeful basis that it's going to have its needs met, and that we live under a system that tries to destroy that, but that it's actually our natural organic heritage. So that when I understand that, for me, something like the rise of fascism, neo-fascist movement in this moment, it's horrifying, certainly, but it didn't shake up my worldview, because having a cyclical, long-term understanding experience with history and with movements, I know that in the declining, waning period of an empire, it'll become more authoritarian, whether it's the neoliberal model through trade agreements or the fascist model through direct rule. But I also know that it's a sign of weakness, and that resilience has a tremendous force, that for centuries, under the conditions of slavery, which are unimaginable, Black people maintained from generation to generation an accurate narrative of what had happened. And likewise for all the wide range of politics that you find in Indian country, you won't find any voices saying, we were really in bad shape until the colonizers came and now they saved us, right? So maintaining those narratives have meant that resistance is unstoppable, that can never be suppressed, which doesn't mean that the balance of power is in our favor. We're still trying to figure that out, right?
Yeah.
But it does mean that it's possible. And the other thing I would say is that we also have to understand why we're weak, why we're on the defensive, right? How is it that identity, which when I was coming into the movement was one of the foundational stepping stones towards solidarity, has now become more like a brand, right? And sort of my synopsis is that identity is what allows us to fight, solidarity is what allows us to win. If all we do is learn about ourselves, we need to do that deep dive. We need to know our people's history. We need to know that we're beautiful. But if that's all we do, then eventually we're actually serving the interests of the empire, because we're not understanding that same depth of beauty exists everywhere in other peoples, and we need to link up together. We don't have to agree about who's more oppressed or anything like that, but we do need to be able to see that in each other in order to actually be able to shift the balance of power. Our enemies know that. We don't. Let's learn it.
Wow. Well, that's a great place to leave it, I think. I just want to say thank you so much for taking your morning to speak with us. It's incredible, and I know it's not about you, but just with this opportunity, it really is an honor, and I really appreciate the work that you've put in and your generosity to share your experience and wisdom with others. And here's to more decades of resistance.
It's about us.
It's about us. Check out Ricardo Levins Morales, beautiful art, great gifts, a great studio to stop in and get filled with inspiration. Thanks for checking us out. Money, power, land, solidarity.
We need money, land, solidarity. If you funny, stand very far away from me. We have running plans about as far